say hello to everybody, and I want to welcome you to today's presentation, Managing for Mental Health, Performance Management in Mental Health. My name is Evan Carl. I'm the Senior Capacity Building Manager here at NYC Service, and we're incredibly proud to feature some amazing trainers from the Mayor's Office of Thrive NYC, who are going to be conducting for you today the third of 3 trainings this month focused on trauma-informed management practices in the age of COVID-19. So, as many of your organizations are either managing volunteers or working to build out volunteer programming, we wanted to provide these trainings free of charge as the situation with COVID-19 has highlighted not only the importance of volunteers in bolstering organizations' capacity during these difficult times, but the importance of being thoughtful about the ways trauma from either the pandemic, recent events in the political realm, and other situations impact volunteers as well as staff members at your organizations. So over the course of these trainings, you've likely heard the presenters discuss how mental health may inform your management of staff, though we do want to highlight that the takeaways from these trainings also apply to your management of volunteers, the ways in which you oversee staff and volunteer performance, and how both volunteers and the staff overseeing those volunteers approach working with clients across the city and with each other. You can go to the next slide, please. One final housekeeping piece from me is that we are incredibly proud to offer interpretation services for today's presentation in 2 languages requested from registrants. That's Spanish and Haitian Creole. So if you want to listen to a simultaneous translation of today's workshop, please call the relevant number and use the meeting ID that corresponds with your preferred language on the screen. We've also posted these conference lines in the chat for anybody who arrives late, and so that you can refer back to them throughout the presentation. Once you're on the correct phone line, please be sure to mute your phone to allow others to hear the translator, and turn down the volume of the English language presentation via Zoom so that you can hear that translation clearly. And I'm just going to throw it over to my colleague, Jessica, who's going to translate those instructions in Spanish.
Thank you, Evans. The following message will be given in Spanish, offering interpretation services. Buenas tardes para las personas que deseen conectarse y escuchar esta reunión en español. Por favor, marquen desde sus teléfonos el número 646-576-3464 o el 212-788-7444 y el número de ID de la conferencia es el 99250, símbolo numeral. Nuevamente, para servicios de interpretación simultáneas de esta presentación, por favor marque desde sus teléfonos el número 646-576-3464 y la reunión o el número de ID es el 99250, símbolo numeral. Si desea permanecer en esta conferencia de Zoom desde sus computadores, por favor, pongan silencio en sus computadores o bajen el volumen para que no haya ruido de fondo y marquen desde sus teléfonos las líneas de conferencia en español que también está en la pantalla. Por favor, asegúrese de poner también silencio en sus teléfonos marcando *6 o poniendo el silencio en su dispositivo para asegurarse de que la interpretación sea clara y no haya ruido de fondo. Nuevamente, el número es 646-576-3464. El ID 99250, símbolo numeral. Gracias. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, Jessica. Next, we have Emmanuel, who will translate those directions in Haitian Creole.
Si nous voulons attendre des présentations aujourd'hui en créole, s'il vous plaît, les numéros ça qui est en bas avec utiliser numéro rendez-vous qui c'est meeting ID qui correspondent à la langue créole. Pour plus meilleurs résultats, s'il vous plaît, descendre volume ordinateur ou avec mettez son sous mute sur téléphone pour permettre l'autre monde tendez interpréter plus clair. Numéro pour créole haïtien, c'est 646 576 34 64 ou bien 212 788 74 44. Si première ligne là pas disponible. Numéro identification rendez-vous qui c'est meeting ID, c'est 66495 avec après ça va peser numéro signe numéro 1 après ça.
Thank you so much, Manuel. And thank you again, everyone, for joining. I'm now going to throw the mic over to my colleagues, Chris and Rachel, who will kick off the presentation.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. Welcome to our third training in this series. Those of you who have been with us the first 2 weeks or part of the second week or part of the first one, welcome back. For those of you who are new, welcome. And so we have a couple ground rules, really expectations for our conversation today. Your video and audio is off during the webinar, just to avoid being a distraction to others who may be trying to listen in or view, right? So if you are able to, please turn your video off and mute your audio. We are going to have a section for a time for question and answers. So please utilize the chat, as some of you have, to say hello and introduce yourselves, but also feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. Towards the end, we'll try to look through the questions and try to answer as many as possible. In the chat, let's be respectful and civil. This is a learning environment. We're here to learn from each other and to share some knowledge that could be beneficial. So let's try to be respectful and civil with each other. Anyone that is not able to do so will be removed from the conversation. But really, we're nearing the holidays, so we're in the spirit of giving. So everyone's going to be respectful and civil, and we won't have to remove anybody. Next slide, please. So about us, my name again is Christopher Linlogue. I'm part of the Thriving Your Workplace team. Thriving Your Workplace is an initiative that works with local employers to strengthen workplace mental health strategy for that particular workplace, right? And so what we do is we work with employers in a consultative manner and provide custom recommendations for that particular employer that promote employees' emotional well-being, facilitate access to mental health care, and helps create cultures of positive mental health at work, right? So anyone on the call that is interested in learning more about how we work with employers, please feel free to reach out to us at any time. Our information will be shared in the follow-up email. Next slide, please. Rachel, do you want to jump in and introduce yourself?
Sure, really quick. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel. I work with Chris on the Thrive in Your Workplace team, and we're really happy to be here to talk to you about management and mental health.
Thank you. And this is my slide with my information. As I mentioned, I'm on the Thriving Workplace team. I am a master's in social work, love mental health, love training. So boom, here we are. Next slide, please. So real quickly, want to talk about the goals for today. So hopefully by the end of this training, you all will have additional knowledge as it relates to mental health and common mental health challenges. We're going to understand the value and effectiveness of mental health support in the workplace, right? So with our colleagues and with those that we volunteer with or manage. And we're going to develop skills to support your own and your employees and volunteers' emotional well-being, right? So we're going to talk about some skills and strategies that you can use with those people that you work with, that you manage.
So I'm just going to, start off by giving some information and context about really being a manager. And in this case, we're talking again, both about managers of employees, but also managers of volunteers. And, while there are some differences about how you might approach that or the kinds of resources you can provide, there's really a lot of similarities. I think, a theme that comes across in this work is that everyone benefits from good management. But we also really want to let you know that, we feel you, and being a supportive manager is a balancing act. You're, listening to folks who are kind of, above you, telling you what to do. You're responsible for managing the folks that you work with. And that's a really tough place to be in. And very few managers are given training, both in general management, but particularly in mental health. And something we know is that managers are often the first people that folks reach out to if they're experiencing some challenges in their own workplace mental health, and are really crucial in both helping people access resources, but also in really just promoting a culture that promotes positive mental health in their workplace. And so, today we're going to be talking about some strategies for managing yourself and your team, but we always really want to stress that you yourself are an employee and you are important. And it's really important to make sure that you're taking care of yourself and you're putting on your own oxygen mask, as they say, to make sure that you're able to take care of your team and your organization in the best way possible. So please keep this in mind as we start to walk through, some of this information about why this is important.
Thank you, Rachel, for that excellent backdrop. So with that, I want to go over our agenda for today. So we're going to go through a little workplace mental health 101. Those of you who have been a part of these trainings, this will be familiar information. Then we're going to get into supportive management practices. We're going to have a case study, which we're very excited about, to kind of walk through a potential scenario. And then we're going to close with some discussion, question, and answer. Next slide, please. Right. So as always, it's always important to understand that mental health is a spectrum. So we like to provide this information as a foundation or starting point for our conversations, right? So when we speak of mental health, it's important to understand that we all have mental health. It's our state of well-being, the way that we cope with normal stresses of life, the way that we work productively and contribute to our communities, right? And so just like we all have physical health, we all have mental health, right? Mental health problems is kind of a broad term that recognizes that mental health is on the spectrum, and it acknowledges the mental health challenges that we experience on a daily basis, right? So we have daily stress, we have stress related to COVID, anxiety related to uncertainty, you know, things that are going on in our home that cause, you know, mental health problems, right? Also in COVID, there's social isolation, loneliness, or grief, right? So these are things that we all may be encountering at various points of time, but aren't necessarily mental illnesses. And so mental illnesses are conditions in which people's thinking, mood, behavior negatively affect their day-to-day functioning, right? So they have a diagnosed mental illness from a mental health professional in terms of that diagnosis that affects their mood, their behaviors, and their ability to day-to-day function, right? So common examples of those include depression, you know, diagnosed, anxiety diagnosed, schizophrenia, and others, right? And so it's important to understand that we all have mental health. We all may go through mental health problems. Some of us may be diagnosed with mental illnesses. It's a spectrum, all right? Next slide, please. And so with that information, we like to talk about how mental health challenges can affect us in different ways. So here in New York City, 1 in 5 adults struggle with mental illness every year. And so this is mental illness. This is people who have been diagnosed with a mental illness. 1 in 5 people, 20% of the population here in the city has been diagnosed with a mental illness every year. Now, the person who's diagnosed, obviously, they feel the effect of their mental illness, but people who come in contact with them may also feel some bad effect, right? So if I have someone in my family who has a mental illness, then that affects our relationship and, you know, our ability to interact with things that we do, right? So even though you yourself may not be the person that's diagnosed, it still has an effect on you potentially, right? Suicide is the 6th leading cause of death. So suicide often is a mental health concern, oftentimes is a result of depression or isolation or guilt or loneliness, things of that nature. But suicide is the 6th leading cause of death here in the city. Both of these numbers do mirror the national averages as well, right? The third point, over 500,000 adults in New York are estimated to have depression, yet less than 40% of them report receiving care for it. So 500,000 adults estimated, right? These are all estimates because, you know, not everyone reports or not everyone has been diagnosed. But of the people who have reported or who are estimated, only 40% of them are receiving care for it. So we talking 500,000, 500,000, only 40% of them are receiving care. That's probably around what, 80,000? No, 200,000 maybe, something like that, right? So even if people are aware that they have depression, they are still not receiving the care that they need for it. And the last point, mood disorders, which are a type of mental illness, a category of mental illness, the 3rd most common cause of hospitalization for both youth and adults age 18 to 44. And we always talk about this age range because this is a prime working and volunteer age range. Not to say that people outside of this age range don't work or volunteer, but a lot of people within this age range work or volunteer, right? So these are just some general data points regarding mental health challenges. Next slide, please. So COVID, COVID-19 still very active, right? We're seeing the second wave, but what we've learned during COVID, that mental health concerns are prevalent, right? And so these mental health concerns have been around, but COVID has, amplified them, so to speak. And so the first data point, 85% of workers feel worried or anxious that they themselves may catch COVID-19. We do have a lot of workers who are out in a physical location doing work, right? Some volunteers out in a physical location volunteering. And this creates worry and anxiety about the ability to catch COVID. Obviously, if you're out, your risk is at a higher level than someone who is working remotely or virtually, right? 85% are also worried about anxiety or anxious that they may lose their job. So even those of us that are working, the economy has been trashed by this pandemic, right? And so that has caused job loss. So people are worried and anxious about that. And just generally, 84% of Americans report really struggling with employment related matters, whether that be mental health concerns related to work, changes at work, or managing money or the house. You know, all those things are work related. And this information came from the Well-Being Lab. So they do a lot of research on employee well-being and people's well-being. And this was a study that they were able to do during COVID. Next slide, please. And one of the other things that we've realized with COVID, or again, something that has been amplified, is that there has been inequity in terms of how it has affected people. And so our colleagues of color are experiencing job loss disproportionately, right? In New York City, frontline workers are disproportionately people of color, making up 75% of essential workers. So the people that have to go out and do work in a physical location, essential workers, 75% of them are people of color, right? And as we mentioned earlier, being an essential worker, being in a physical location increases exposure and infection risk, right? Furthermore, people of color are less likely to work in an industry or have jobs that offer sick leave or work culture that allows them to take time off as compared to their white employees, right? So 75% of these essential workers are potentially working in a situation where they're not allowed to take sick leave, right? Or not encouraged. There's no culture around it. So what that means is that they have to go to work. They can't afford to take time off, again, increasing their exposure and infection risk. Workers without paid sick leave are more likely to go in when they're sick. So not only are they having to go in, but if they happen to get sick, they're more than likely to go in if they don't have paid sick leave, right? So they may be infected and maybe in turn infecting other people, right? Next slide, please. And so another common thing that people may be familiar with is this term burnout. And so there are many contributing factors to burnout. We often think about it as just overwork, right? There's just too much work to do, right? There are other factors that contribute to burnout, which we'll get into in a second. But a poll that was taken of professionals about their experiences reported 73% burnout at the end of April, right? So kind of when we were, 6 weeks into our COVID pandemic, at least here in New York City, 73% of employees said that they were burnt out, right? As opposed, and that was a 12% increase from mid-February before we got into stay-at-home orders or the craziness around the pandemic, right? 61%, which is still high, right? But it jumped up to 73%. And so it's important for us to understand why there was that increase, potentially why there was that increase, right? And so one of the factors that contributes to burnout is an idea, a lack of control, right? And so the pandemic has created great uncertainty, from the virus response to how we do our work. Those of us that went remote had to figure out how to do everything remote, we couldn't necessarily control that, right? The response to the virus, is there going to be a vaccine or is there testing? All these things are not necessarily in our control, right? So that's one contributing factor. The boundaries between work and home are blurred, right? So role confusion and ambiguity. I'm at home. I know I'm supposed to be on a meeting, but I also have to help my kid with their homework, or I have to get my parents situated with their their doctor's appointment that is now virtual. So there's a lot of blurring of the lines and role confusion, right? I can't say at this point in time from here to here, I'm at work. Because if I'm at home, I'm at home. So things are going on at home. I can't, look the other way, right? So a lot of confusion in that regard. And as we're talking about home, shelter at home or isolation. So we are people that enjoys being around people, right? And so for the most part, we've been isolated in our homes. Even those of us who have been working and have gone physically to work, you may go to your location, work a couple hours, work your shift, but then you come directly home. There's no chance to interact with other members of your community besides your coworkers or besides your family, right? So that has led to some isolation, which again, lack of community is a contributing factor to burnout. And as we just mentioned in the previous slide, there's been a general lack of fairness in terms of how communities have been affected and how populations have been affected, right? It's important to note, like, we're talking about burnout in terms of employees, but volunteers also can feel burnout. And sometimes it can be worse because volunteers, as we remember, they are oftentimes working for free. They're volunteering. They don't receive a stipend for their work. They may be receiving credit in some form, but they're not getting paid. So that's one aspect of it. And they may be balancing their volunteer work with other volunteer work or with a job, right? So their potential risk for burnout is increased, right? So it's important to note that. But, you know, there's good news. Mental health support helps, right? And so people who experience a mental health issue will recover and live happy, active lives, right? If they receive the diagnosis and treatment that they need, right? Which is the second point. 80% of employees treated for mental health problems report improvements in their job satisfaction and their productivity, right? So if I work at a company and I have been struggling because of some of my mental health concerns, but I receive treatment and my job understands that I need treatment, I feel happier about this job that I work at, this volunteer site that I work with, right? And I'm more productive. I'm able to do my work in a more productive manner, right? So mental health support works and it's important. So when we talk about employers and how they can promote good mental health, there are a couple of things that definitely stand out. You know, the workplace and volunteer spaces can be activated to do the following things, right? They can increase access to and quality of mental health care. So a lot of people, and this is potentially for employers, volunteers may not always enjoy the same benefits, right? Our access to healthcare comes through our employer, right? And so as an employer, we need to ensure that we are increasing that access to healthcare and mental health care and ensuring that the quality is strong, right? Create a supportive environment that promotes positive mental health. So this is for employees, volunteers, for whoever. Any environment, workplace environment that we have should promote positive mental health, and employers can do that, right? Managers, as we mentioned, a very difficult job. We understand that, and we're going to talk more about how to be a supportive manager because managers play a critical role in creating supportive workplaces, right? Oftentimes, I go to my manager before I go to anybody else in my organization with a concern or need, right? And so managers are really the first level of support that an employee or volunteer looks for, right? So managers can form strong relationships with their direct reports, and they can influence the organization's operations and cultures as leaders, right? So as a manager, you have the ability to talk to higher levels of the organization as opposed to someone who is an entry-level staff or a frontline worker or a volunteer, right? So it's important for employers to seek to support employee mental health because there is a economic benefit, right? The World Health Organization study estimated that every $1 that's invested in prevention and treatment provides a $4 return in terms of improved health and productivity. So the more that employers are actively and proactively working to support mental health, the more that they reap the reward in the future in terms of health, you know, people not leaving the not leaving work or being absent, and productivity. I'm at work and I'm able to do work in the most productive fashion. I see a question. Can you provide a direct link to that study? Yes, we can. I'll make sure that it'll be in the follow-up email. All right, so now that we have this background, Workplace Mental Health 101, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to talk about supportive management practices.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us. So there are a variety of ways that managers and leaders can support their volunteer and employee mental health, all of which start with focusing on your own individual self-care and well-being. You know, it's really important to make sure that managers, you know, should not be expected to be clinicians or to be there to sort of guide and provide treatment for staff and volunteer mental health, but to make sure that they're really creating a culture in which it's okay to talk about and reach out for help. You can lead with compassion by really modeling how you want people to treat you and how others should treat themselves, and foster this environment both, you know, virtually and physically that promotes positivity. You know, sometimes that can include reaching out to do a sort of fun Zoom activity. Sometimes it's saying, no Zoom cameras on Friday, we get it. You know, some other ways to support this are to create opportunities for social support. I think as the pandemic, you know, continues, it's going to be increasingly challenging to figure out how to maintain these connections, you know, when we really can't see each other, especially in a place like New York, where it's getting colder. And, you know, while the summer gave us a bit of a respite, you know, it's going to get more challenging. And finally, managers can share mental health resources widely. As Chris mentioned, for those who are employed at organizations, you know, that's often the source of their healthcare. And so that can be a really valuable resource. But there are also a lot of free resources available in New York City for anyone who might want to talk to someone. And Chris and I will share some of those resources at the end of this training. So before we get, super into this conversation, I wanted to address some concerns that we hear a lot about talking about mental health in the workplace and as part of volunteer programming. So one of the primary goals of this presentation is to correct a misconception that employers have that they cannot talk about mental illness at work. And we understand that many managers can have concerns about engaging employees in these types of discussions, including being afraid of receiving pushback, negativity, or feeling like this conversation is way over their pay scale. But to the contrary, it's vital for employers to create a culture of acceptance that encourages employees and volunteers to speak out about any mental health issues they may be having, and to make it easier for these employees and volunteers to find solutions to their struggles. There are specific laws that talk about, Americans with Disabilities Act, and there are very specific processes to go through for accommodations. We can provide a link to a free resource that talks about this in layman's terms that I have found very helpful as a non-lawyer myself. But, we really just want to make sure that people know that it is okay to talk about mental health in a supportive way in the workplace. And we're going to provide you with some really clear guidance about how to do that and the things that, you shouldn't be saying out to other folks. But so just keep that in mind. So what are some general principles about talking to folks about and engaging with them and your colleagues about mental health? So as I mentioned, remember, you're not a therapist, do not diagnose or label. And I think this comes out a lot in our sort of, more kind of colloquial terms, like, oh, that person's crazy. Like, oh, his OCD means he can't let anything be undone. And it's not intentionally sort of mean or malicious, but it's something to keep in mind, particularly as a manager, where that power dynamic just means that your words are going to be taken differently. So inquire about how people are feeling and listen actively. Use supportive language and maintain a positive outlook. And again, share mental health resources. So for folks who are struggling, they can really get the support that they need. So, all right, Rachel, how do you do this? Okay, so here are some general tips about best practices to communicate effectively and positively with employees you think may be experiencing a mental health challenge, but will also be helpful in managing workplace conflict or other strong emotions that may come up in the workplace. Let's break this down. So ask open-ended questions. So how are you feeling? Has this been an issue before? And this is as opposed to, you seem depressed, what's happening? Give people room. You can relate by sharing individual challenges. I think, COVID-19, as Chris said, has affected all of us, not equally, but we are all experiencing some type of this collective trauma. And you can say, yeah, like it can sometimes be really hard for me to focus at home too. When I have my kids on Zoom and, the plumber's here, which was what happened to me yesterday. Acknowledge different experiences and needs among people. And again, this relates to, don't assume that your experience is the same experience that other folks are having. I recently have been staying with my parents who are older, and it's really made me realize that I did not fully appreciate how challenging that is for other folks who aren't living with elderly people or people who may, be at higher risk of getting COVID. It adds a level of anxiety that I didn't fully appreciate. So really think about, other people and make sure that you can ask questions to understand what their experience is so that you can support people in the right way. And practice reflective listening. This both shows that you're really actively listening to what the individual is saying. Oh, so it sounds like you've been having trouble sleeping. And so it's been hard to make the 7 a.m. meetings. Is that right? But it also really validates what they're saying and makes sure that you as a manager understand what they're telling you. That I think can be challenging. Things mean different things to different people. And so practicing reflexive listening can really help you make sure you're on the same page to co-create a solution going forward. As part of these conversations, you want to focus on the behavior, not the cause. And so this kind of goes back to what I was saying about, you're not there to diagnose, but you can talk about what you're seeing. And especially in the workplace. So this is related to conversations around performance and productivity. How are you engaging with their work? Communicating with coworkers. One thing we've heard is increased interpersonal conflict, because tone in email can be really hard. And just, if you're seeing that folks, for instance, are having a hard time, again, coming to a morning meeting. So don't attempt to diagnose or force this information. For instance, don't say, you acted really manic in that last meeting. What's up? Disclosure, you know, I think sometimes there's too much of a focus that people have to disclose whatever they're experiencing. And in a workplace, you know, you don't necessarily have to do that, but really sort of it's what's happening and what you need to move forward. And avoid making negative assumptions. For instance, he is always late to meetings because he's lazy. She's really aggressive because she's a jerk. You know, we all have these sort of gut biases to remember what we see most recently, or, you know, to assume things of other people that we would kind of be more understanding of in ourselves, but just to try to remember that as you're thinking about employee and volunteer behavior. So here are some examples of how not to talk to someone with a mental illness. And I think, you know, these are things that really do usually come from a good place or from a lack of knowledge. So, you know, just try to stay positive. You don't look depressed. I felt sad once when my dog died too. I think these are just examples of things where people, you know, just don't understand what's going on. But you really want to avoid sharing these types of things with people who may be experiencing a mental health challenge, because it can really make it worse. And also, if you're worried about some of the, you know, sort of legal implications, you know, these can be added on there about ways that you're not supposed to talk to folks in the workplace. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about what supportive management looks like, but supportive management during and after COVID looks a little different. This is not business as usual. You know, nothing about what is happening right now is usual. You know, there is a great economic uncertainty. Many folks are experiencing furloughs and layoffs, increased caregiving responsibilities, and just a higher level of anxiety and worry. Performance management is always hard, but remote work has made it even harder, but more important for employers and employees. So this pandemic is really requiring employers to rethink their performance management strategies to respond to the changing needs of employees and organizational priorities. So, you know, really what we're saying about this is it's important to hold people accountable and have standards, but now is really time to think about, you know, what are these priorities? What does good performance look like? And how are we effectively communicating that with our employees? So we have and could devote an entire, you know, hours-long training to what it means to develop a strong performance management system. But we're just going to go over really quickly some of these key elements. So first, whatever you're doing, you want to demonstrate fairness and transparency. You want to make sure that you're applying sort of an even lens across different behaviors and being transparent about what good performance looks like. For instance, let's say you're working at a food pantry or managing volunteers at a food pantry, you know, part of your performance measurement is showing up on time to, you know, get food out and prepared and ready. You want to make sure that everyone, you know, is held responsible for that. Even if someone's a supervisor, not necessarily working on the line, they should still have to be there. And making sure that you're communicating your expectations with different employees about what that looks like. You want to co-develop goals and metrics for success with employees. It's been really clear that a lot of the time, particularly if you're working in remote work, where now just sort of being in the office isn't an indication that you're at work. What does that success look like? How can you develop goals together? So really think about what these success and metrics are, and really having that conversation with an employee can increase buy-in and make sure that you're all, you know, steering the boat towards one location and know what that end goal is. Provide development and coaching opportunities. Feedback can be really challenging to receive. Feedback can be really challenging to give, but it's really, you know, how we learn and grow. And so model this behavior in yourself as a leader, that, you know, you want to receive feedback, that you're open to receiving feedback from different sources, and really try to provide quick in-time feedback to your employees. Performance management and you know, feedback doesn't have to be, you know, waiting until the end of the year, and shouldn't be to tell someone that they've made big mistakes, but can be just, you know, in real time, like, oh, you know, this is actually the correct statistic, or, oh, you know, this is actually the best way to communicate with that person to get a response. And finally, as part of all of this, holding yourself and your employees accountable for the work. Let's go back to this idea of showing up on time at a food bank. If you're not showing up yourself, how can you expect your employees to do the same? I think, you know, people see what the expected norms are and will model those. And so it's really important that we're all holding ourselves accountable for what we're saying we're going to do as part of an overall performance management system. So good management allows organizations and volunteers to thrive. It's a critical role in creating an emotionally supportive workplace. So what we mean by supportive management is that this is a process by which supervisors can help staff and volunteers improve their work performance in an ongoing way. So it's both about addressing individual goals and over project goals overall. So let's say you're working on a grant proposal with folks, it could be about helping an individual employee get more writing experience about grants, but also you want it to be a good grant because you want to get that funding. And it's important to note that many employees and volunteers will struggle with mental health challenges at some point in their career. And in most cases, these challenges may have little or no impact on their work. Chris and I were speaking to a very high-functioning, high-level executive at a bank the other day who disclosed their own mental health struggles. And, I think it's really clear that she is a top performer at her organization. But providing supportive supervision is not about lowering standards. And I think this is a big misconception. COVID changes, how we apply accountability, but does not remove it totally. And so we're going to talk about, while we're holding people accountable for their actions and providing this supervision, how can we do this in a supportive way? So there is a 5-step process to address performance issues with staff and volunteers. Evan, were you going to come in here? My notes died. Is that in a few slides?
Yeah, I can happy to handle this next one. And when it comes to addressing performance management, obviously that's a very complex, or can be a very complex situation. But fortunately, we do have this 5-step process to address performance issues with staff. So I'll just do a quick run through of those, and I'm going to try to do them with sort of a volunteer and employee focus. So first, you just want to make sure that you're understanding employee rights and protections. So when it comes to employees, employers have an affirmative obligation to provide reasonable accommodations for employees with disabilities, which includes employees with mental health impairments. We recognize that this is something that can be very difficult to sort of manage on your own, so you shouldn't do it on your own. You should partner with somebody else at your organization, whether that's your HR department, whether that's your boss, to just be sure that you establish a standard procedure for requesting accommodations while ensuring that all employees are aware of that procedure. In addition, you should also be sure that other managers and supervisors are trained on cooperative dialogue and any relevant legal requirements. Now, while volunteers aren't necessarily considered employees and therefore don't meet the definition of employees entitled to reasonable accommodation, you should still seek to make your volunteer programs as accessible as possible and be sure to follow organizational, local, and state guidelines. It's also important to keep in mind that an accessible project is a strong project and one that will allow your organization to ensure you're bringing in the highest talent available from the largest pool of applicants. Therefore, we highly recommend that you ensure your volunteer programs are accessible to anybody interested in taking part. Second, when addressing a performance issue, you should discuss recent changes in behavior with curiosity and compassion, as Rachel mentioned not too long ago. You should be sure to prepare yourself emotionally for the conversation, and you should also follow some guidelines for discussing mental health at work. As Rachel mentioned, that includes asking open-ended questions or relating to the volunteer or employee by sharing your own individual challenges. You should also be aware of and acknowledge the different experiences and needs among people. And as Rachel mentioned, practice that reflexive listening, which involves paraphrasing employee concerns, validating what you hear, and asking clarifying questions. Third, you should identify specific performance challenges and co-develop those solutions with the employees or volunteers. So prior to engaging the employer or volunteer, you should first consider whether you have a role in the situation. Are you doing everything right and there's no need to improve? Is your approach aimed at bringing about new behavior on behalf of the volunteer and employee, or does it focus too much on old behavior? Are you looking at the bigger picture, or are you simply focused on an isolated situation with the employee or volunteer? So, as Rachel mentioned, when you open up a dialogue, you should focus the conversation on behavior and impact. This will keep the conversation consistent and focused on objective pieces. That means talking about job performance and engagement with one's work, communication with coworkers and other volunteers, as well as physical capabilities and daily functioning of the employee or volunteer. So when it comes to having that performance talk regarding a volunteer or employee's performance, it's best to do so in 5 steps. First, you want to identify the specific task, responsibility, or behavior that's at issue. Second, you want to have the employee or volunteer describe what success looks like in that area of work. Third, you want to have the employee or volunteer identify what they need from you or the organization to be successful. Following that, number 4, you should co-create a timeline for implementation of the solution. And then fifth and lastly, as a manager, you should ensure that the employee or volunteer has the capacity to complete the required tasks or steps needed to implement the solution. Down to number 4, once you've identified the problem and developed a plan to move towards solution, you should review and follow up on progress. You should schedule regular interviews or regular check-ins with the employee or volunteer. You should identify issues early if they continue to occur. It may help to develop a reporting tool to measure progress, such as a process improvement form or a weekly tracker with specific metrics. You should also be sure to offer praise and positive reinforcement whenever you witness improvements. Finally, that being said, for number 5, if performance issues continue, you should be sure to develop a plan for next steps. If good performance is sustained, as I mentioned, offer praise and move on. But over the course of these conversations, sometimes they work, and in reality, sometimes they don't. So in the event that they don't, you're going to need to make sure that you identify a plan. So if the issues aren't addressed, once again, you shouldn't feel the need to do this on your own. You should feel comfortable reaching out to your HR team or your manager to consider next steps, which can range from a variety of things, such as a leave of absence, a performance improvement plan, or termination. Note that all of these pieces apply to volunteers as well, especially if volunteer behavior is impacting the project or other employees and volunteers. Termination may be difficult, but there are scenarios where it might be an appropriate response for the good of your organization, the team you're managing, and the outcomes of the project you're working on. Now, with all that being said, before we get to that point, as a manager, you should always be sure that you're thinking about what types of mental health challenges volunteers and staff may be dealing with. Oftentimes, supportive management and emotional support can really go a long way. So you should always be thinking about what your organization can do to prepare for and support those who make your work possible. And with that, I can throw it back to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Evan. So, okay, so now we are going to take an opportunity to really put in practice what some of the tips that Evan said and some of the items that I shared. And so I'm going to go over to Chris to help walk us through our case study.
Thank you. So, case study, Diane. Diane has been a very successful volunteer supervisor at her organization for over 10 years. Over the last few months, management has laid off several members of her team, and Diane and the other volunteers have had to pick up the slack, working extra long hours and weekends. Diane's remaining volunteer team members feel very worried about their own jobs, in addition to feeling resentful, overworked, and underappreciated by leadership. In addition, Diane's children have been doing remote learning, and she has had to balance supporting their needs with getting her work done. Diane's manager has noticed that she has been more irritable, coming late to meetings, and has mentioned that she is no longer working out and has had trouble sleeping. How should Diane's manager handle the situation? So let's take a look at one way the manager can handle the situation. I'll be playing the role of the manager, and Rachel will be Diane. Diane, what's wrong with you over the past few weeks? I needed those TPS reports a week ago, and I still have not heard back from you about our newsletter.
I know, I'm sorry. It's just been really overwhelming. Our team is trying hard, but with the reduced staff, it has been impossible to keep up with the volume of work. I've been feeling really stressed out, and it's been really hard to focus right now.
Look, Diane, we're all stressed right now. This is the time to step up. You should feel lucky that you still have a job.
Okay, got it. I will figure something out.
You better. So what happened after that meeting? Right? Diane's physical and mental health continued to decline, as does her work and performance. Right after the meeting, Diane sends her coworkers a terse email telling them to ship up or shape out. She starts sleeping even less and feels groggy and increasingly anxious. Finally, she goes to her doctor, who instructs her to take a leave from work to focus on improving her health. Diane takes 6-week leave, increasing the workload and emotional strain on the remaining team members, and there's just a general loss of productivity. Next. So let's take a look at a different way that the manager can handle that situation. Again, I'm the manager and Rachel is Diane. Hi, Diane. It's been a while since we have checked in. I wanted to see how you were doing.
I'm fine.
I wanted to check in because I've noticed that there are a few deliverables that have fallen behind. And I heard you mention that you have not been working out, which I know is very important to you. You don't seem yourself lately. Is anything up?
You know, things have been really hard lately with the reduced staff to keep on top of everything. We have fewer people and more work, not to mention that my kids are doing remote school, which is very stressful and time consuming during the day.
That does sound really hard. I know I have been feeling very anxious about what has been going on recently too. And the news can be very overwhelming right now.
Thank you. It is very challenging. I've been working 10-hour days and I can't sleep at night because I have so many thoughts going through my head. And sometimes it seems as though people are acting as if this is business as usual, which it is clearly not.
I'm really sorry to hear that. And I want to help and make sure that we come up with some ideas to mitigate this stress. What can we change to make work easier?
I think we need to look at some of these deadlines and think about what can realistically be accomplished with our reduced team.
That makes sense. I'll follow with some of the other directors to identify priorities right now and what we can push back to a later date. I will make sure to get back to you by the end of the business day today with an update.
And it would be really helpful if we could move our morning meetings to later in the day. I have to get my kids set up on Zoom in the morning, and it's really hectic to balance both of those things.
I didn't know that. Thank you for telling me. We can definitely move our meetings to the afternoon. Is there anything else that you can think of that would be helpful?
No, I think that sounds good for now.
Thank you so much for sharing these concerns with me, Diane. I really appreciate it and want you to know I will take them seriously. I'm going to reschedule our morning meetings to the afternoon and reach out to the team to prioritize deliverables over the next few months. Let's plan to follow up in our weekly check-ins so that we can see what's working and if there's any additional tweaks that we can make.
Okay, that sounds good.
Finally, I want to remind you about NYC Well. It's a free resource which provides confidential mental health support. You can speak to a counselor via phone, text, chat, and get access to mental health support and substance use services. They are available both you and your family, and I encourage you to take time to reach out to them if needed. So, what happened after that meeting, right? Diane meets with her team, to talk about the workload, and shares a plan to prioritize different deliverables. She also shares that she has been feeling very stressed and is working to address the issue, and encourages her team members to reach out to her and NYC Well if they are feeling the same. Diane's manager reviews the current work deadlines and creates an updated deliverable schedule and puts items that are not current priorities on hold. He also reschedules their meetings to the afternoon. Diane slowly begins to start taking walks and get back into her physical activity, which helps her with her sleep, in turn, boosts her productivity. So wrapping up, we're talking about manager checklist for promoting mental health. Again, we want to identify some free mental health resources, sometimes that are available within our organization, but also throughout the city. Our office has many resources that are available. We'll share those. Prepare yourself emotionally for the conversation. Make sure that you're in a strong, positive health headspace and use techniques that were mentioned in this training, right? Reflective listening, open-ended questions, things of that nature. Schedule a time and private space for the discussion, right? We wouldn't want to have this conversation in front of other people, right? That someone may not feel trusting of the other people to open up about their struggles, right? So try to make it a place that is private and schedule time so that you and your subordinates can have that conversation. Again, ask open-ended questions, demonstrate empathy and vulnerability. If it is appropriate, share that you also have been feeling anxious or stressed or worried or concerned. Practice active listening, right? So pay attention to this employee, try to stay off your emails, or if your phone, just engage with this person in a conversation and actively listen to them. Co-develop a plan and timeline, as you saw in that case study. The manager worked with Diane on some things together that they can do, right? Not just determining, okay, we need to do this, this, and this. Engaged her in the plan. So co-develop the plan. And lastly, again, after you identified all those resources, please make sure to continuously share resources to encourage employees and volunteers to use them, right?
So thank you so much, Chris. And thank you, Evan. So, moving forward, we're really in a new phase of working and learning together. This is, uncharted territory for us. And I like to think of a quote that President Obama said, "Never let a crisis go to waste." I think this is a really challenging time for all of us, but it's also a great opportunity to think about, things that we had in place and how we can make them better. So good management benefits everyone, any employee, whether or not they're experiencing a mental health challenge, and all volunteers. And so now is the time to think about redesigning our processes to build a better system for all. So now we have some time for questions. So please enter your questions in the chat and we will check it out. And so while we are doing this, again, I want to really take the opportunity to thank, obviously, my partner in crime, Chris, but Evan and Jamaica for inviting us and collaborating with us for this opportunity, and for all of you for participating in these trainings. So I'm going to go check out the chat. And Chris, have you seen, do we have any questions that have come in?
We have a couple related to what will be shared. So we will share this presentation following, in an email follow-up. The 5 steps that Evan was mentioning in terms of performance management, we'll make sure to include those 5 steps on a slide or in the body of the email or attachment so that you'll be able to utilize those as well. How do you suggest, we have a question that just came in. Thank you for that.
Great.
What do you suggest for 2 employees that are having conflict with one another?
So that's a tough one. So Chris, I can start out and then you add on. So I think it is important to remember, that we are, all adults. And so you want to encourage your staff, to try to work things out, with each other first. However, I'm guessing if you're asking us this question, you've probably done that and it didn't work. So I think, for you as a manager, and it depends if you're managing both of the employees, that might make it a little bit easier because you can guide the conversation and expectations. So I think it's really important to think about how you can have a conversation with your employees, identify what the conflict is, and see if there's something folks can, work through, and then set clear lines and deliverables about what is important and what this expected behavior is. One trainer we work with a lot likes to say, you can't give people a personality transplant. So we do need to figure out a way to make folks work together. And as a manager, I would try to get specific, see if there's an issue you can solve, but then keep that accountability issue in there and set clear expectations. Chris, is there anything you would add to that?
No, I mean, I think you did a great job. I mean, it's much, I think you provide some good information. It would be easier if you're managing both to try to get them together or engage in conversations with both at separate times. Everything else that you mentioned, Rachel, was excellent.
Great. So now I'm just looking through, we got a bunch of questions. So how would you suggest handling a situation where a work from home employee is not responsive or communicating at all from a manager's attempt to check in and see what is going on? So first, again, I would start out focusing on this behavior. As an employee working from home, I assume, there is some work going on. And so it's really important to think about saying, hey, I've noticed you haven't been responsive to emails and you haven't been coming to some of our, team meetings, what's going on? And see what the employee says. Again, try to work through if there are those challenges. And then set the guidelines like, okay, it sounds like morning meetings are really rough for you. We can work on switching to afternoon, but it's really important that you're there at these meetings. And then document. I think any HR professional will tell you that. And then really, work with them towards those goals. Again, the current COVID crisis does not change the importance of accountability, but it shifts how we provide it. So again, is there something you can do to make it a little bit easier for that person to communicate? But again, this isn't an excuse to just not communicate and to hold them accountable for that.
And I would say to that as well, definitely lead with compassion, right? And so try to ascertain if there are issues that are going on with that employee at their home, right? That may be preventing them from communicating, but also potentially you may be able to find that information out through teammates, right? So if someone can't reach me, they may be able to reach Rachel. And Rachel might know something that's going on with me, and she can inform people, oh yeah, he's offline right now because he's dealing with a personal issue, right? And so if you are not able to directly reach them as the manager, you may potentially be able to get information through the use of teammates. We may have time for one more question.
Okay, so
and
it looks,
they're coming in fast and furious.
I know. So which we really appreciate, and for all those who wrote us comments, thank you so much. So it looks like, is it wrong that I think that the last soliloquy would have been more effective by sending a link and giving a heads up that they might find useful, rather than typing or reading out that entire paragraph? It's good info to share, but would never be all read out like that in the real world. Yeah, I think, you know your audience, you know your colleagues, and, communication, everyone has different styles. So do what works best for you. And even sharing written information can, be more helpful in some ways to access it easily. All right, so Chris, should we try to do one more question?
Yeah, we're going to rapid fire. We can try to take one more.
All right, Chris, you pick it. You pick the question.
Oh, geez, I didn't have one queued up. Let's see. Okay, I'd love tips on how to manage supporting individuals you are managing that are struggling, and creating a space to acknowledge that, but also not taking on the role of playing their therapist, right? And so, as we mentioned, and as I am a trained therapist, and even still, I tell people I'm not your therapist, right? So it's always important to maintain that boundary, even as a manager who has subordinates who wants to spill and dump particular things. We are there to support and listen, but we should consistently say, I'm not your therapist, or maybe not in that exact verbiage, but refer them to resources that could be more supportive and helpful for them. I'm not trained in this to engage in a long conversation about things that you should do to manage your depression, but maybe you can reach out to our EAP program.
Yes, and so I think that's exactly right. And we'll stay on a few minutes longer because we have a short evaluation poll that I just launched that we really welcome your feedback. It helps for Chris and I to be able to, talk to our supervisors about our performance management. And, we really use this information to guide these partnerships and how we can move forward. So thank you so much, everyone. I see you're filling it out. I should have launched that sooner. We really appreciate it. But since we're here, we'll do, I'll add on to Chris's answer and we'll do one more question. So in terms of managers and really creating that space, again, it really starts out with having you be in your own good headspace. And I recommend, if you didn't, to go back to our session last week, which really talked about practicing mindfulness and some, sort of cognitive behavioral strategies to think about, reframing how some of our negative thoughts. Because as we said, it is so important to really take care of yourself before you have these conversations. So I would start out with, that's really your self-care affects all of your organization. As a manager, if you're stressed out, everyone really can tell. And it's, really creates a tone throughout the organization. Then, it is important to set boundaries. I'll say that some of our partners we've talked about have actually had the opposite problem, where they felt like too many people were sharing, too much in the workplace, where it was just becoming overwhelming. And, so I think you want to give people a safe space to say, oh, it's just been really hard, being at home with my family 24/7. But if it gets into, folks talking about things like I've been drinking way too much or something like that, that's where you really want to guide the conversation and bring it back. But so creating safe spaces can really be, is this a meditation time? Are these physical exercise activities? We talked to a partner that did a virtual farm animal tour, which I actually thought sounded really cute and fun. Chris is the head of our sort of emotional social support in our office, and did a really fun Halloween event where we were all able to come together. But again, take care of yourself, create sort of specific spaces where folks can come share, but really make sure you have those boundaries to connect them to other resources. All right, we still got the folks responding to the poll. Thank you so much. I'm just looking to see.
There's one I saw that I think we can touch on real quick.
All right, go for it, Chris.
What do you suggest when an employee is 20 years younger than their 3 other team coworkers and working at the front desk? The younger employee feels bullied. What should they do? Well, if they've expressed that to you, I think they've done what they were supposed to do, right? What we should do as managers and other coworkers is try to find some commonality between us, right? We all are working for a particular organization. That's one commonality, right? So maybe we engage in a dialogue about why we're working for this organization. And maybe if we find some commonalities, that might reduce people's tension that they feel based on age, right? So a worker who's 20 years older than me, I may not be able to connect with them on particular things. They might talk about a style of music that I'm not familiar with, for instance, right? But we may actually love, working for feeding homeless families, right? If we're working at a food bank, for instance, right? And so that's an area that we can find commonality and, build cohesion and build connection, which might reduce the bullying, right? So this gets back into identifying forms of social support, ways that we connect with each other and things that bring us together as opposed to things that are different between us. So that's one thing I would suggest, or some things that I would suggest. Rachel, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think that, makes a lot of sense. And in our other performance management sort of longer, more in-depth training that we provide, we talk about some different types of, like biases. And one of the biases is basically called similar to me, where we like people who are more similar to us. And so you want to make sure that, you're kind of challenging that. Like, is there a disagreement about this? Is this again, you can't give people personality disorders. Is there a performance issue here? And if not, everyone's not going to be as close in a workplace, but everyone should be treated with respect. Everyone should be kind. And managers really have a responsibility to make sure their teams are doing that and to look out for any sort of clickiness that might be coming out. Again, look, like we're all adults and, not everyone is going to have the same type of friendships, but this is a workplace, this isn't a, party at your house. And so really making sure that the expectations are very clear about how you treat other people and how you communicate. All right. I think we've gotten a bunch of responses in the poll. And so I, really appreciate all of first of all, your kind words in the chat. Like you guys have no idea how much Chris and I value, especially since we can't see your faces, how great it is to see that. So thank you. We really appreciate that. Thank you again to Evan and Chris. Evan will be sending out follow-up materials, and he can also share the resources to the previous sessions if anyone would like to attend to those as well. And we'll also send out our Thrive in Your Workplace website because we have a whole host of other resources there that folks may find helpful. So with that, I'm going to end the polling. And thank you again so much for participating. We really appreciate it, and have a great rest of your week.